There are paths that don't appear on any map, trails that only emerge when we lose our way. And there are houses that never turn on their lights unless a weary soul needs a place to rest. It was a meeting between two survivors, each bearing a scar untouched by the city lights. And from the frozen edge of the world, where snow blankets even silence itself, a fire was lit. Not loud, not dazzling, but real. The black SUV raced silently along the winding curves of the Colorado mountains, where towering pines stood like mute sentinels. The season's first snow was falling thick, clinging to the windshield like a sheer invisible veil, slowly erasing her vision. Eliza Bennett, 36, New York's top cardiothoracic surgeon, gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles stiff and white. On the passenger seat, her phone blinked no signal. The fuel light flashed red. Outside, the wind howled like the strangled cry of some long-buried memory. "Snow's falling faster than forecast," she muttered, her voice dry. Barely a whisper, more sound than speech meant only to keep herself alert. The car veered slightly off lane, its rear tires sliding over the icy road. Eliza jerked the wheel, the brakes screeched, cutting through the stillness. Then silence. The engine had died. Stillness. The headlights dimmed. All that remained was the blinding white of the storm and the pounding of her heart, like the final sutures of a high-stakes operation. She tried the door. A blast of icy wind slapped her across the face. Within seconds she was drenched. Her Burberry coat was no match for mountain winds. No signal, no people, no turning back. She gasped, eyes scanning the world around her. Then far off in the blizzard's haze, a flicker of orange shimmered against the gray sky. A cabin, a hunting outpost, a spark of hope. She didn't hesitate. She ran into the snow each step, sinking deep into ice lashes crusted with frost. Her luxury shoes soaked and hardened like stone. Her hands shook uncontrollably. Her lips were turning blue. Still she pressed on. At last she reached a small wooden cabin, tucked against the mountainside, light flickering behind the window, a thin thread of smoke curling from a black steel chimney. On the door, a carving a lone stag. She raised her hand and knocked. The first time, no answer. The second, the wind nearly ripped her arm away. The third, the door opened. A man stood there, tall, broad, ash-gray, flannel, dusted with soot. Eyes sunken from sleepless nights, sharp with wariness. He said nothing, just watched. She panted, pride forgotten, composure lost. Her voice cracked. "Sis, sorry, my car broke down. No signal, I'm going to freeze out there if..." He studied her, then without a word, stepped aside. She stepped in. The door closed behind her. The wind was shut out and within came warmth, the glow of the fire, the scent of burning pine, and the metallic tang of hot steel from a forge in the corner. His world. No screens, no schedules, only iron fire and silence. She collapsed onto a wooden chair by the hearth, barely able to believe she was still alive. He approached and draped a thick woolen blanket over her shoulders. His eyes never stopped watching. Cautious, measured. "My name is Eliza," she whispered. The man gave a slight nod, then answered Caleb. His voice was low, like cracking stone, rough, honest. And in the hush of winter, with only the crackle of burning logs, two worlds collided, city and wilderness, a heart trained for resilience, and a man who no longer believed in anything but survival. They didn't know yet. Nothing would ever be the same again. The air inside the cabin felt frozen in place, only the crackling of the fire, and Eliza's heavy breaths remained as she struggled to stay composed. She had changed clothes into a flannel shirt and coarse wool trousers Caleb had given her, oversized, rough, but strangely warm. She sat close to the fireplace, both hands wrapped around a wooden cup, holding a strange tea fragrant with wild mint and juniper. Caleb stood a few steps away, resting one hand on a blacksmith's hammer. His gaze was sharp as a blade, unwavering. "I didn't mean to intrude," she began, her voice hoarse from the cold. I didn't think anyone else was out here in these mountains." Caleb said nothing. He glanced toward the window where the snow was still falling, thick as if the world outside had vanished. Then he turned back. "There isn't for 100 miles around. I'm the only one who survives winter." "Why choose to live like this?" she asked, then immediately regretted it. "Sorry, I shouldn't pry." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Didn't choose, just stayed. That's all." Eliza frowned slightly but didn't press further. The firelight cast their shadows on the wooden walls, like two souls from different worlds trapped in the same place. She took a small sip of tea, then quietly said, "I'm a surgeon city cardiology." Caleb raised an eyebrow, his gaze drifting to her hands. Slender defined knuckles, nails perfectly trimmed. Hands like those, not made for axes or lighting fires. "And hands like yours," she replied with a soft smile, "aren't meant to stay silent this long." For the first time, the corner of Caleb's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. A reaction. "I'm not good with guests, not used to them." "I don't often get lost in a snowstorm either," she replied. Then more gently, "Honestly, I've never stayed in a place like this. No signal, no voices, no phones ringing all day. Try living that way for a few years," Caleb said, stepping toward the fire and prodding the embers with an iron rod. "You won't want to go back." Eliza studied him more closely. The fire etched his sharp features in glowing relief, rugged wild, yet carrying a quiet depth. His eyes, dark amber, always seemed to look through people, as if he was listening to what they didn't say. "How long have you lived here alone?" she asked softly. 7 years. "No one comes. The last one who came never left." His voice dropped. The air thickened with silence. Eliza didn't respond. She sensed something behind those words. A loss, a shadow, a truth he wasn't ready to revisit. After a pause, she shifted the subject. "So, where should I sleep tonight?" Caleb gestured to a small loft above the stove, where a sheepskin-covered mattress and thick folded blankets awaited. She nodded gratefully. "If the snow clears tomorrow, I'll leave." Caleb said nothing. She stood, started up the steps, then turned back. "My name's Eliza, but my friends call me Liza." "I'm not your friend," he replied, not looking at her. "Then maybe after tonight, I'll be less of a stranger." She ascended the loft stairs, each step heavy. Caleb watched her, his eyes no longer as cold as before. In his hand, the iron bar began to glow red in the fire, but something else was heating too. Not metal. Something he'd locked away for years. "Eliza," he repeated silently, a name soft as snow, yet leaving a burn in his mind. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, something had begun to crack open, though neither of them realized it, yet the fire in their hearts had just been lit. Eliza woke in the middle of the night, not because of noise, but because of the absolute silence, a kind of silence that didn't exist in New York, where even at 3 a.m. there were car horns and flashing lights cutting through high-rise windows. This was the kind of silence that forced you to hear yourself every heartbeat, every breath, every faint crack of dry wood beneath the loft. She rose from the mattress. The blanket still smelled faintly of natural wool and burning pine. The wind had stopped howling, replaced by the soft hush of falling snow, like someone sifting white powder over the roof. Eliza descended the stairs like a shadow, her long hair tousled barefoot in thick woolen socks. Caleb was still there, sitting before the now cold forge back against the wall, holding an unfinished knife in his hand. The oil lamp cast a muted glow on his face, solitary like a nameless statue carved from time. "You haven't slept," Eliza spoke softly. Caleb didn't look up. "I sleep very little, out of habit. Or are you afraid of nightmares?" He lifted his head and looked at her. Not angry, not defensive. Just surprised that someone had reached the exact place he thought no one ever saw. "You're rather direct. I've cut open hearts for 10 years, she said. "I'm not great at evasion." Eliza moved closer, sitting down across from him. They looked at each other, not like strangers from two different worlds anymore, but like two people who were simply the last ones still awake in a world gone cold. "I've stayed up through plenty of nights too," she said quietly. "Not because of work, but because I didn't know, if I closed my eyes, whether I'd even want to open them again." Caleb set the knife aside. The way he looked at her now was no longer guarded. It was acceptance, as if they were carrying the same thing, a tired heart. "I used to be a firefighter," he said, after a pause. "There was a fire I went in. Didn't get them out in time." Eliza said nothing. She didn't ask who. His voice made it clear that person wasn't just a number. "They called me a hero," Caleb said with a faint, bitter laugh. "But I called myself a coward." "You didn't run," she replied. "You've been living with an open wound that takes more courage than any medal." Caleb looked at her as though hearing that for the very first time. "And you," he asked, "why were you driving alone in the middle of a snowstorm?" "I was being honored at a mountain medical conference," she said with a dry smile. "They called me the modern symbol of female success. And you left the award because you wanted a shortcut. I left because I was tired." She exhaled. "Tired of pretending to be someone I didn't recognize anymore. I thought, if I saved enough lives, maybe eventually I'd save myself. The small room filled with silence. No one reached out to hold the other. No promises were exchanged, only understanding. After a while, Eliza whispered, I think sometimes God lets us get lost, not to punish us, but to lead us somewhere that wasn't part of the plan. Caleb smiled. This time, for real. And you think this cabin is destiny? I think. Eliza looked at him, eyes unwavering. I've never felt safer next to someone who knows nothing about me. Caleb stood and offered her a hand, not to hold, but to help her up. Get some sleep. The snow might melt tomorrow, but tonight's still long. Eliza stood but didn't walk away yet. She just looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said, for opening the door and for not asking too much. Caleb gave a slight nod. He watched her disappear up the loft stairs, then turn back to the hearth. Outside, the sky had begun to clear. A few stars peeked through the pitch-black heavens. Inside, Caleb gently laid a hand on the unfinished knife, but this time he didn't keep forging. He simply stared into the fire and thought of the woman with a heart full of scars, just like his. By the time Caleb heard the cough, the night had slipped into its deepest hours. The fireplace held only a dull red glow, and the sky beyond the window had turned the heavy gray of approaching dawn. A dry, relentless cough echoed from the loft, sharp burning. He rose instantly, forgetting the unfinished knife in his hands. 3 steps up the wooden ladder, bare feet pressing against the ice-cold boards. Eliza was curled up on the mattress, her face flushed with fever. Beads of sweat clung to her forehead, like winter frost, her lips dry and trembling. Liza, Caleb called, softly kneeling beside her. Can you hear me? She opened her eyes, glassy and unfocused, the usual composure in her face, replaced by fatigue and pain. Her body shivered like a branch caught in a freezing wind. Just the flu? I'm fine, she whispered, her voice raw and cracked. Caleb didn't respond. He turned and descended the stairs, poured warm water, mixed something from a jar of wild honey, and a few dried herbs hanging by the kitchen wall. When he returned, hands full with a clay cup and a clean cloth, Eliza had drifted into an uneasy sleep, her skin still damp with sweat, as if her body was fighting something far deeper than cold. He sat beside her, gently lifted her head, and brought the cup to her lips. Drink, he murmured. Ophiopagon, root, honey, cinnamon, bark. Works better than any pill. She managed a few sips. Her throat burned, but the warm liquid slid down her chest like summer melting into her lungs. Caleb soaked the cloth and laid it on her forehead. Do you do this often? She asked faintly, eyes barely open. Only when someone's dying in my house, he replied softly, his voice light as wind through a cracked window. A minute passed in silence. Eliza's breathing began to slow, but then her voice broke through like someone muttering in their sleep. I hate fevers. When I was 8, I curled up in the pantry. No one believed I was sick. Caleb looked up, frozen. They thought I was pretending to skip school. She continued, her words drifting like a fever dream. I wasn't pretending. I just wanted someone to put a hand on my forehead and ask, "Are you okay?" He swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the pillow. His eyes blurred with something he refused to name. A part of him wanted to leave run from these wounds reopening, but he didn't. He replaced the cloth, wiped the sweat from her neck. His movements were so gentle they wouldn't have woken a soul, but firm enough to warm the places illness had forgotten. Eliza opened her eyes again, clearer this time, more aware. You're not what I thought, she whispered. Neither are you. They looked at each other. For a moment, the cold loft became the only place in the world where warmth truly existed. Not from the fire, but from an unconscious touch, a few sparse words, and the silence that said more than language ever could. Thank you, she said quietly. Caleb brushed a lock of hair from her face and pulled the blanket up to her chest. He stood to leave, but before he could turn away, she asked, Have you ever cared for someone with a fever before? He paused, then looked back, his eyes dimming slightly. Yes, but the last time was 7 years ago. And that time, I failed. Eliza wanted to ask more, but couldn't. Her strength was gone. She drifted into a deeper sleep this time, dreamless, silent, just steady breath. Caleb stood there, his shadow long across the wooden ceiling. The night stilled. But in both their minds, something deeply human, deeply real had begun to stir. Not a blazing love, but a tenderness everyone yearns for, yet few ever dare to receive. The next morning, Eliza woke up feeling light. Not because the fever had completely subsided, but because she no longer had to keep holding herself together. The little loft was still quiet, but outside the first sunlight after 3 snow-covered days streamed through the cracks in the wooden walls, casting warm golden stripes across the floor. She got out of bed and made her way downstairs. Caleb was out on the porch holding a hammer, nailing back a board that had been knocked loose by the storm. He wore a charcoal gray sweater, the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned, sinewy forearms. He paused when he saw her. "You shouldn't be walking around so soon," he said, without turning fully. "I'm all right now," she replied, leaning softly against the doorframe. "Actually, better than all right." Caleb stopped hammering. He turned toward her, his eyes reflecting something unreadable. Caution, perhaps, or that familiar fear that when the sun returns, people leave. "The snow's melted," he said, nodding toward the narrow trail in the distance. "I can take you to the highway. There's a supply outpost nearby. You can call a car from there." I see Eliza nodded. Her voice dipped sooner than I expected. They stood in silence between them, just a few feet, yet it felt like light years. Every unspoken thought hung in the air like snowflakes suspended in time. "Thank you for everything," she said, her eyes sincere. "I don't think I would have survived without you. I only did what anyone would do." "No, Caleb," she shook her head gently. "Not everyone lets a stranger into their world, especially when they're not even sure they want to be saved." Caleb's chest rose slightly. He let the hammer fall to the porch and stepped closer. "I'm not a good man, Eliza," he said, voice deep and rough, like gravel. "I live out here because I stopped believing I could hold on to anything." "You held on to me," she said softly. Their eyes met, and in that moment, sunlight caught in Eliza's hair, making her look like something not of this place, a woman from another world lost on a mountain, carrying a fire she didn't even know she possessed. "I'm going to leave," she said at last, "because I can't live here waiting for snow, just to know I still feel." Caleb nodded, but his face darkened. He understood, and he hated himself for understanding too well. Eliza stepped closer and pulled something from her coat pocket. The old linen handkerchief Caleb had used the night of her fever. "I'm taking this with me," she said, placing it in his hand. "To remember that someone once sat by my bedside all night, with no reason other than kindness." He closed his hand around it. His amber eyes, for the first time, glimmered with tears. "Liza," he said, his voice hoarse, "if you stayed..." She looked at him hopeful, waiting for something. "If you stayed, you'd forget who you are," he said, "and I can't be the one who takes your world away." "And what about your world?" she asked, her voice catching. "Who will stay with it?" There was no answer. An hour later, Caleb stood on the porch watching the SUV he'd repaired disappear into the line of the distant pines. In his hand, he still clutched the handkerchief, the only piece of her that remained. Not because he didn't hold her back, but because he didn't dare hold on to something he didn't believe he deserved. New York welcomed Eliza with blaring horns, flashing billboards, and hurried footsteps along Fifth Avenue. But to her, everything was quiet, like the sound of rain tapping against a sealed window pane. Her private car slid past the gates of the hospital, where she served as chief of surgery. People buzzed about her miraculous return after 3 days missing in the snow. The media hadn't yet sensationalized the story, but inside she knew the rumors had already spread. Her assistant handed her the morning bulletin, where a small line read, "Dr. Eliza Bennett, missing in snowstorm, found safe Monday morning." No one mentioned Caleb. No one knew he had sat beside her bed all night. No one knew she had once cried for a hand that never let go when she needed it most. At the executive board meeting, Eliza sat at the head of the table, her white coat immaculate, a Mont Blanc pen in hand, but her eyes quietly drifted toward the window, where the towering concrete buildings stood like walls without souls. One board member spoke up. "We'd like you to speak at next week's Woman of the Year event." A symbol of success, resilience, and independence. She smiled faintly. A smile even she didn't recognize. "I think, maybe I don't want to be celebrated for never falling." She said, "I want to be celebrated for having the courage to stop." The room fell silent in confusion. That evening in her private office, Eliza opened a drawer. The coarse linen handkerchief was still there, neatly folded still, carrying the scent of wood and old ash. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched it. She remembered Caleb's eyes, the silence by the fire, and his words. "If you stay, you'll forget who you are." But she hadn't forgotten. For the first time in her life, she remembered who she was when she stopped trying to be anything else. She stood and stepped out onto the 27th floor balcony. The city wind was strong, thick with the scent of exhaust and asphalt, but in her mind she could still smell burning pine wood and hear the muffled hoofbeats crunching snow. That night, Eliza didn't return to her luxury penthouse. She stayed in her office, her hand gripping the handkerchief. She didn't cry, but her heart ached like it had just lost the most precious thing it never dared to name: a wooden porch, a quiet man, and a peace that didn't need proving. The next morning, she submitted a 6-month leave of absence. No explanation. Just a short handwritten note: I need to remember what made me begin before I lose it forever. 3 weeks passed. Eliza did not return to the hospital. She didn't attend board meetings. She didn't show up to the prestigious awards ceremony where everyone had hoped she would appear in her signature silk blue gown, smiling in front of the cameras. Instead, she spent most of her time reading old books, walking alone through Central Park, or sitting on the rooftop, watching the hazy skyline blur like fading memories. One early morning in a small coffee shop on 10th Street, she absent-mindedly flipped through the local newspaper just to pass the time. She intended to read only the headlines, until her eyes stopped on a grainy photo: a man in a gray flannel shirt standing beside the county sheriff. Headline: Reclusive. Blacksmith rescues 2 in snowstorm. Caleb Reed, a reclusive resident of the Winter Creek Mountains, opened his cabin during the early January storm when a couple became stranded in their car with fuel running low. Eliza stopped breathing. Not because Caleb had saved someone else, but because the press, the indifferent world she had once belonged to, had finally reached the place she believed no one knew existed. He declined to be interviewed. The article quoted the sheriff. We had to bring the commendation to his cabin. Caleb only said one thing: I didn't do anything special. I just didn't want anyone to die in the cold alone. Eliza folded the newspaper and held it against her chest. That sentence, it was the reason she was still alive, and the reason she could no longer sit here not one more day. She left the coffee shop and hailed a taxi back home. In an old leather satchel, she packed a few simple things: the handkerchief, a bottle of local honey, and a folded piece of paper on which she had written a few lines, unsure if they were enough to redeem anything. At 4 p.m., the rental car left the city heading west. The winter sky stretched wide, pale gold sunlight, drifting like a promise never kept. The pine trees reappeared one by one, like memories stirring from sleep. She didn't know if Caleb would still be there, if he would still be as silent as the day they met, if he could forgive her for leaving without a word. But she knew if she didn't return now, her heart would never know peace again. When the car stopped at the familiar mountain trail, dusk had reached the hilltops. The last light of day fell across the roof of the old wooden cabin, the place where a man had once laid a cloth across her forehead, without question, without expectation. Eliza stepped out of the car. No designer coat, no phone in hand, only herself, bare, trembling, but real. As soon as the car stopped, Eliza heard it, the steady clang of metal echoing from behind the house. She recognized the sound instantly, the hammer striking the anvil, the same rhythm, the same force, as if time itself had stood still in this place since the day she left. She stepped out, her feet sinking into the patchy melting snow. Her heart pounded like it did before her very first surgery, not out of fear of failure, but because she didn't know if she would still be accepted. Caleb was standing by the forged sleeves rolled high, his face damp with sweat, despite the lingering cold. He didn't turn when she approached, perhaps because he couldn't believe what his eyes were telling him. I came to return this. Eliza spoke, her voice soft but clear. She held out the neatly folded handkerchief in her hand. Caleb froze. The iron hammer dropped to the wood with a dull thud. He turned and their eyes met. One beat, a slow blink, then silence, but the kind of silence heavy with impact. I read the article, she said, slowly stepping closer. They called you a hero, but to me, you didn't just save my life. Still, he said nothing. You saved a part of me. I thought I'd lost long ago. The part that believed I deserved care, that I was allowed to be weak, that it was okay to need someone. Caleb lowered his gaze. His voice, when it came, sounded like it rose from the depths of his chest. I didn't think you'd come back. I didn't think I should. She stopped now, just one arm's length away from him. I was afraid that coming back meant letting go of everything I'd built. And now I know everything I ever built means nothing without what I found here. Caleb looked at her, truly looked. For the first time, no deflection, no walls. I have nothing to give you. Eliza, no spotlight, no city, no bank account. You have dry firewood, honeyed tea, and hands that once kept me alive. She said, tears falling silently. And if you're still holding on to me, then I'm still holding on to you. One step, now only a breath, stood between them. Caleb raised his hand slowly as if moving too fast would shatter everything. He touched her cheek, lightly brushed away the lingering snowflakes from her hair, and whispered, "You have no idea how long I've waited just to see you again." Eliza closed her eyes, letting her tears soak into his hand, and I had no idea how lost I was until I found my way back. They embraced. Not the dramatic kind of embrace born of grand reunions, but the quiet anchoring kind where two people hold the last pieces of themselves to make sure that this time they won't lose them again. Behind them, the sunset poured through the forge's doorway, soft amber blending with rising smoke, casting a warm glow around them, as if nature itself had agreed. What is real is never too late. Spring in Winter Creek didn't arrive in a rush like it did in the city. It came slowly, like the man who lived in the wooden cabin, unhurried, unshowy, but steady and deep. Each tender shoot pushing through the melting ice, each drop of sap flowing quietly through the trees. And Eliza stayed. The cabin now had a small bookshelf beside the fireplace, where she kept old medical books and a few odd volumes of poetry that Caleb occasionally read late at night when he thought no one noticed. She planted vegetables beside the horse stable. The hands once used to surgical gloves were now stained with earth, but they no longer trembled. In fact, for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was chasing anything. Caleb, though, still as man of few words, had grown used to her laughter in the kitchen. He still rose early, still forged steel, still brewed water with herbs. But now he made an extra cup because he knew someone would drink with him. One afternoon in May, Eliza received an email from the hospital. They asked if she planned to return as chief of surgery. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she picked up her phone and stepped out onto the wooden porch where Caleb was repairing part of the stable roof, damaged by the last of the spring snow. He looked up when he saw her. "An invitation," she said, holding up the screen, "to come back. Surgery conferences, prestige." Caleb nodded. His eyes held no jealousy, no pressure, only quiet, as if he were letting her ask herself the only question that mattered. What do you truly want? She put the phone away. "You know," Eliza said, sitting down on the wooden steps, "I used to think I couldn't survive unless I had a major surgery waiting for me every morning." And now he asked. She looked at her hands slightly rough from gardening, but her heart warmed at the memory of harvesting her first onion. "Now I feel having someone waiting for me every morning is enough." Caleb didn't say a word. He simply sat beside her, his hand gently resting on her back a touch, without spectacle, but enough to tell her, "Here you don't have to succeed. You just have to be." That night, Eliza opened her laptop. She wrote an email. "Dear members of the board, I know the role of chief requires someone who is always present, always sharp, always ready. I was once that person, and I know I did it well. But now I choose something else. I choose a life that doesn't require a race. I choose a small home where I'm remembered not for titles, but for a smile. Each morning I know this may not be what anyone expected, but for the first time in my life, I'm choosing for me. Sincerely, Eliza Bennett." She hit send, then closed the laptop. Caleb was out in the yard, building a fire, a real one, not the glow of a screen. She stepped out, wrapped her arms around him from behind. "I'm staying," she whispered, her cheek against his back. He didn't turn, just gently placed his hand over hers, holding it. "I know," he said. "I felt it the moment you came back." Summer arrived earlier than usual. The pine forests around the cabin turned a deep emerald green, and swallows swooped in flocks over the still lake. And in the small garden corner of Caleb's home, the wildflowers Eliza had planted with her bare hands had begun to bloom purple, yellow, and white, untamed, just like their story. The wedding? There was no music, no media, no silver-lined banquet tables or extravagant wedding gowns. Eliza wore a simple white linen dress she had sewn herself. One rainy afternoon, Caleb wore a plain shirt, sleeves rolled up just like when he forged iron clean, but still himself. They stood in the meadow behind the house, where sunlight poured like slow dripping honey, surrounded by a few close neighbors and a group of children Eliza taught on weekends. One of them, a brown-haired girl named Hannah, once a child from the shelter where Eliza volunteered, read the only line spoken during the ceremony. "Not all who wander into the forest are lost. Some find themselves there." Caleb held Eliza's hand, the weathered hand of a man who had known loss now, wrapped tightly around the hand of a woman who once believed she was unworthy of love. No one asked them to kiss, but they did gently like a summer breeze, yet deep as a vow that needed no words. Afterward, the cabin was extended with a small classroom. Eliza began teaching free community health classes for nearby villages. She no longer practiced medicine in skyscrapers, but she healed more lives than ever before. Caleb still forged metal, but now he taught the local kids how to shape tools, how to create with their hands, skills the city had made them forget. Each night they sat on the porch, no TV, no alarm clocks, just Eliza resting her head on his shoulder, tea in hand, and the wind carrying the scent of flowers from the far field. A year later, when a journalist from a major magazine asked to interview Eliza about why she had vanished from the medical world, she simply smiled and replied, "I didn't disappear, I just found something." Not everyone is lucky enough to have a life that doesn't need winning to feel like enough. On an early autumn day, Hannah, the little girl who had spoken at their wedding, ran up to Eliza and hugged her tightly, handing her a handwritten note on lined school paper. "You're not like the other grown-ups. You look at me like I really exist. You make me believe that a kid like me can become something good." Eliza held the girl close, falling not from sorrow, but because love doesn't just save a person. It makes them someone who can save others. The end. When the first snow of the new season fell over Winter Creek, Eliza and Caleb stood at the window, hand in hand, looking out toward the quiet white forest. They said nothing, because sometimes true peace doesn't need to be spoken. It only needs to be lived. If this story touched your heart, remember sometimes the greatest things in life don't live in success or fame, but in the way someone looks at you for no reason at all.
Thank you for listening to The Whole Story. Stories Across Time is a place where timeless stories are retold with emotion, compassion, and the power of belief. Each video not only touches your heart, but also helps you see life through a deeper, more reflective lens. If you love heartwarming, inspiring, and soul-healing stories, hit subscribe and join us on a journey to discover life's most meaningful messages. Subscribe to Stories Across Time today, where every story matters.